Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, it's been a hot minute since we covered some alternate history. And this recent video really caught my eye because it's actually one of the topics I love talking and hypothesizing about a lot. And that is, what if Cortez lost to the Aztecs? So the original video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you're supporting Alternate History Hub. I think of all the alternate history sites out there, it's the one I think predictable of the alternate history outcomes. So I'll be excited as always with these alternate history things. Do you agree with the outcomes that are going to come out of this? Want to hear those comments down below. All right, let's get started. So to answer the question, what if Cortez lost to the Aztecs? To me, it completely, the setup has to be, why did Cortez lose to the Aztecs? Okay, so my thing would be if he lost just militarily, then I think that is going to have a very different outcome than what if he lost because, and this is the big one for me, the disease did not settle in like it did, because that was the thing that destroyed the Aztecs, was the disease. So if there was some kind of immunity to the smallpox and stuff like that, and that's why Cortez, lost in this scenario, that's going to be very different than if they lost militarily. And I'll be interested to see which kind of take they went, and I'll try to, at least at some point, give my thoughts on both of those things. But it totally depends on why he lost. All right, let's see what Cortez.
Hernan Cortez, conquistador, explorer.
This is a great what if, by the way.
Supposed to be a lawyer. I didn't know that. But after hearing tales of Columbus,
he was young. He was in early 20s too.
Packed his bags and left home to chase glory in the New World. Didn't take long for him to make a name for himself. For his contributions in conquering Cuba, he was elected mayor of its capital city, Santiago. After a few years and gaining some wealth, he hired an armada of 11 vessels and 500 men to set sail for the uncharted lands of Mexico. Once ashore, he ordered his men to
something to think about. The Aztec Empire probably numbered around 30 million people at this time. Tenochtitlan, the capital, which they're going to eventually siege, probably had upwards to 250,000 people.
No turning back. Little did they know they were about to face the most advanced civilization in the New World. After 2 years of the most intense last man standing battles in history, shaped by a divide and conquer strategy, a smallpox epidemic that was more deadly than the Black Plague, and the largest naval
percentage-wise, 90% of that population died, probably, of that 90%. Black Death, you're around third, 2/3 to a half, at most 2/3, but never close to 90.
On a lake, the Aztec Empire than the Black Plague, and the largest naval battle ever on a lake, the Aztec Empire was dead, and New Spain was born. But here's an idea. What if that expedition failed? Like, what if the Aztec civilization withstood Cortez's invasion and lived to tell the tale, survived to fight on another day?
And because of not having to succumb to the disease or militarily defend themselves.
But before we talk about that, have you ever wanted to take down an entire civilization with a small group of men? Turn the tide of a war with a single bullet? Well, then you just might like today's sponsor, Warpath. Warpath is a real-time strategy game
play out if you want to see it,
where you command your forces and triumph in battles without having to sail the Atlantic and risk being sacrificed. Whether it's building your base,
which of these games are actually good?
Forming alliances, or conquering territory, there's plenty of ways for you to show your strategic brilliance. And now you can grab one of many customizable sniper rifles, realistically modeled down to the scope. Warpath Sniper offers a diverse array of missions, where you get to destroy buildings, assassinate VIPs, and protect your allies from miles away. So gear up, aim your rifle, and be the savior of the battlefield. Man, what an idea. One that for some of you, you might just imagine isn't all that impressive, because the Spanish will just send even more conquistadors.
Anyone else just I can never get over the fact of that we don't have Tenochtitlan anymore. How cool would it have been if that city had not been destroyed and just completely redone and all that by the Spanish? We had this capital city on a lake like that. I think that would just be, it'd be so cool. It's such a travesty that was destroyed and replaced.
Doors the next time. All right, so here's an idea.
I apologize
Let's
for
find the
coughing.
point
Still
of
got a lingering one
divergence
from my
that
ailment.
gives the Aztecs the best chance at survival. Hell, maybe they not only resist the Spanish, but successfully pull off the sunset invasion. The Aztecs sail east, landing on Europe's shores. The kingdoms of Aragon and Castile fall
this stuff
to
wouldn't have
thousands of jaguar warriors. Well, maybe not that
This would
far.
never have happened.
Where could we start? Say the Cortez expedition just never happened in the first place.
Okay.
Maybe they get hit by a storm and are left stranded somewhere in the Yucatan. It'd be like Castaway, but with conquistadors.
My thing already right here would be just another group would have come.
Many would die, perhaps even Cortez himself.
Like,
their
you know.
disappearance becomes a warning to any would-be adventurers. I don't know.
Like with what
Still,
happened to the Inca
eventually
and
somebody
Pizarro.
would arrive to make first contact. Could change a lot, but I think we could do better. Say Cortez lands where he meant to, and engages with the natives, but when Montezuma invites him to the palace, instead of showering him with gold, he showers Cortez with arrows instead. Just kind of kickstarts the whole thing earlier, huh?
Okay.
Hey, maybe one of those arrows hits Cortez and kills him. It'd be quite the morale buster for the Spanish.
That is one of the interesting things that pretty much happened with both the encounter in South America with the Inca and then up north in North America here was not just arresting these Spanish conquistadors right away. Both they were let in, and in both scenarios, they pretty much kidnapped the emperor and
How
extort
about
him.
this? When the Cuban governor who hated Cortez sent his force to seize him,
That's right.
what if instead of Cortez absorbing that force, he was apprehended instead?
Yeah.
No. That just
A few weeks ago, I did kind of reaction commentary to Armchair Historian did one about the conquest here, and I learned a ton from that about that, and it goes into more about how the Spanish were actually trying to capture Cortez. He was on the run from them as well. A lot of people don't know that a lot of these conquistadors were hated by Spain. Christopher Columbus got in huge trouble and was imprisoned and stuff. And these guys that are famous that were like brutal. They thought that like Columbus and Cortez were like too brutal and also too power hungry, like even for their own time. 'Cause a lot of people are like, oh, were they violent in this for like their time? Yes, they actually were.
the victory over Cortez to the Spanish instead of the Aztecs. I got it. In 1520, the Spanish got the Aztec Emperor killed, right? Massacred thousands of unarmed civilians during a festival.
We don't know exactly
and barely
who killed
got out
him, but
Tenochtitlan alive.
if it was the people
What
or
came
the
next
Spanish.
was the Battle of Atumba. 20,000 Aztec warriors, all armed with shields and spears, charging at Cortez. Out of gunpowder,
It's important to note here that the Spanish probably had an indigenous army with them of up to like 100,000 people. That was most of their army was recruited people that were disgruntled with the Aztec Empire. That was the fighting power that Cortez won with. Remember, it was 500 Spanish.
his men formed up in a defensive square and held their ground for hours. As they were about to collapse, a wounded Cortez saw the Aztec leader, marked by his golden armor and silver plumes, and galloped at him at full speed. This was a heroic yet insane charge that somehow turned the tide of the entire battle. An unrealistic ass pull by the history writers for that episode, I gotta say. But in the
These
end,
Aztec is
600
quite
conquistadors were victorious.
overrun, yeah.
In that battle, all it could have taken was one random spear, maybe a rock to trip up his horse. So many little factors that could have led to Cortez being captured and probably roasted alive on top of that pyramid instead of being revered as a deity. Okay, you said
The thing is, though, disease was settling in because of these encounters, because of the encounters with the Spanish and their own indigenous allies, and then all of it between that, between the two. This is the vehicle by which the disease was spreading. Okay, warfare is about the worst way worst way meaning the most effective way for disease to spread. So that still would have happened here, even if there would have been a military loss here, it still would have annihilated the people. So again, that's why I was saying the whole disease thing has to be taken account here to hypothesize the
so
outcome.
Cortez fails in this battle. He dies. What's the big deal? The Spanish are just gonna send more troops. History would play
Probably
out all the same,
group.
no matter who was in charge or when it happened. Oh really, Jimmy? Oh really? Look, Aside from Cortez's insane plot armor,
That's why I like to
and leadership
take the
skills,
disease argument.
The Spanish weren't just able to overwhelm the Aztecs because of
outcome.
their technological superiority, but because of something a lot don't really talk about: psychological warfare. I'm serious. The European arrival coincided with the prophesized return of the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, this feathered serpent. Those string of victories, the ferocious cavalry charge, and that deafening artillery all worked in unison to paint the picture of an invincible army. That's why tens of thousands of indigenous people joined him. I mean, they also hated the Aztecs, who used them for human sacrifice, but the prophecy thing really helped too.
I gotta jump in here a little bit, because at least, correct me if I'm wrong on this, you guys, the whole like that he was the second coming of this god thing, I was pretty sure that I heard that was debunked. That Cortez actually made that up when he got back to Spain. That whole thing that it was ignorant religious belief or something like that. But that's just where my current understanding was, because I heard about that whole he might have been a god thing, and that ended up weakening, I guess, the defenses, or whatever it is, or in this case got those people to other indigenous people to go with him. But I've also heard, and again, I got to look more at sources, that we found out that he actually made that up. There was no real good evidence that was ever the case, that he made that up. So if anyone knows any more about that, let me know if you've got some good sources. But that's what my current understanding is he made that up.
Trust me.
But it was far more about they recruited him because people hated the Aztecs. The Aztecs were brutal imperialists like that way. They basically put their provinces under like a military state, pretty much, and demanded a lot when it comes to tribute, sacrifice, all of that stuff. There's a lot of reasons for people to hate the Aztecs, the neighbors there.
It was the ultimate morale booster. Who's to say that if those things didn't align, if the natives would have felt confident enough to join Cortez against the much stronger Aztecs? Say Cortez doesn't have favor from anyone. His expedition fails, his allies abandon him, and the Spanish are all left to be burned on the sacrificial altar. Throughout Mesoamerica,
and by the way, may not have been that necessarily he made up the whole legend that they're like a god, the Quetzalcoatl reincarnated or returned or something would happen, but like he may have heard that story before and then attributed that to himself. He may not have, again, invented that was something that they prophesied, but invented the fact that he said that they thought that he was that second coming, if you will.
Incursion acts as a loyalty check. Every city-state that sided with the foreigners would be brutally reprimanded by the Aztecs, solidifying their dominance. This external foe would be the perfect glue to strengthen a broken society.
Okay.
To the natives, the Spaniards' 6-month stay in Tenochtitlan would have revealed their true intentions. Cortez smashed their idols, burned entire cities, and carried off with as much gold and silver as he and his indigenous allies could carry. The Aztecs never fully learned that the Spanish could never really be trusted. Conquistadors only cared for gold and God. Yet the Aztecs cared for something too: their art of war. This was a warrior culture who did nothing but expand for nearly a century. One that already had basic knowledge of ironworking, they just didn't use it for military purposes. Iron was used for rituals.
They did not have iron
only
weapons.
Rituals. Instead, they relied on obsidian, which was sharp enough to get the job done.
True.
And was
you can't make a weapon out of white heat. You see that what this guy made?
Instead, they relied on obsidian, which was sharp enough to get the job.
Like you could never make a knife like that. They'll like wrap around. It'd be a one-time use weapon, like wrap around that and like make a leather handle. Obsidian is sharp, but it's extremely brittle. It's great in small parts. And it's very, small pieces. What they would do is get like clubs essentially, and then put into it pieces of obsidian that could really mess somebody up. But again, it's brittle. It's going to break.
Done, and was also really abundant. But what if after witnessing what steel could really do, how utterly outcompeted they were compared to these new invaders, maybe the Aztecs' favor of obsidian begins to change. Now, I know there are some religious reasons for why they used the metal that they did, but look, very much like humanity surviving
cut up on the chest cavity for
Aztec society
removal
could go
of the heart
on the
and sacrifice
defensive after facing annihilation, something we never really saw them do in our own timeline. They never got a chance to truly resist, and were just overwhelmed at first contact. Had Cortez lost, we're talking
Are we into the
about
hypotheticals? Because they resisted greatly.
possibility of the Aztec
eventually,
Empire
yeah.
adapting to these new dangers, preparing for the next encounter. I mean, it's a possibility. It's also possible they could just sit there and do nothing. The aristocracy just believes they've won, and the gods favored them, or whatever, so they just continue on as usual. But not all natives would feel the same way. Some other cities, particularly on the coast, may use weapons that the Spanish left behind, or gain them through trade, which is something I'll get to in a bit.
Wouldn't have been that abundant.
Whether the
Wouldn't have been very
Aztecs wanted
abundant,
to
though.
or not, gunpowder and steel was going to reach their territory by European or native rivals. By some
The process by how you make that is what's important, though. Not just getting the materials themselves, it's the technology itself that would have to be transferred. Would that have been? Maybe.
means, either suddenly or gradually, the Aztecs would be scared, forced by this outside threat to adapt. Muskets, cannons, and swords would be left as war trophies. Perhaps some might even be implemented to cut down resistance, fight other cities, while also being reverse engineered. Captured Spanish weapons might be adopted and given an Aztec touch.
That's where it
you could
become
say.
influential.
Like how the natives
Reverse
adopted
engineering.
guns against the Americans, but decked them out in native symbols.
Oh, those are way
and
cooler
feathers.
looking.
Within a generation or two, the Aztecs might have their own little technological leap, like how Japan did in our timeline.
Well, if the relationship ended up coming into one, that was more positive. Looks like he was about to talk about Japan. That's what Japan, when Europeans first started to show up in the 1500s of Japan, they traded for that, right? The Japanese had a warrior culture of the samurai, and like, hey, your weapons look pretty cool. Let's trade for that. Let's get that technology going. So if they could have had a more positive relationship, like the early Europeans did with Japan, eventually, Japan shuts its doors, to the West largely. If that technology had spread that way to the Americas, then yeah, that would have been useful. But to get out of it, why would that relationship have even happened? Would it have been something though where like Europeans would have used it like with slave labor? Because the sale of firearms to African tribal leaders for guns is one of the major things major ways that Europeans got slaves out of Africa, was to do that. So a lot of interesting things that I guess could have happened that would just depend on what the relationship would have been after Cortez wasn't going to, it wasn't going to be successful conquering. Would it have then been more of a trade relationship, or like we said, the hypothetical too, would just another conquistador group have come up?
It's drastic, but it'd go from the Bronze Age to Iron Age. At first, they'd simply use steel for their normal weapons, clubs with iron shards, thick blunt iron swords, simple steel plates under jaguar skins, and maybe, with enough time, ones that might resemble armor of old. We might see the new world begin to fuse with the old. What may come from this blend of early modern European weaponry and Aztec minds is just fascinating to think about. It's something we never got in our time.
Yeah,
All
would
right.
love to see it. Again, you have to take out the disease thing. If the disease thing doesn't happen, a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, I'm definitely on board with, hypothetically, getting technology from the West, having basically forced, the Europeans forced to have to deal with them and trade with them, and get that technology that would have led to their growth. And, who knows, maybe you have some kind of Aztec Empire still today,
Right, that's cool and all. But all of this is from one interaction with Cortez. What's stopping the Spanish from just sending more troops to finish the job? Spain's colonization of the New World wasn't simply just sending soldiers to take a region. This was practically another planet. Only the bravest, boldest, and frankly, most impulsive gave up their lives for fortune an ocean away. And now 800 of
There were
those
some wild
men
dudes that
would be
were part of
dead
this.
after Cortez's failure. That would be a majority of the conquistadors in Cuba, all depleted. Most would have gone off with Cortez or to capture him. Once news of what happened reached the mainland, many adventurers may steer clear of Mexico, instead opting for other places that had just been discovered.
Probably.
Cortez's folly may become a warning tale, an infamous defeat nobody wished to replicate.
Probably still have what happened in like, what today would be the United States, more north, you know what I mean? Still, because you didn't have the large unified empires in the northern part of North America. Probably still have that. Would have been a similar story down in South America. Depends. But
Like Custer's last stand. Others would always eventually try.
I
I
think the difference is you wouldn't have that Spanish empire that we know of in the West. British still probably get involved. I don't know. maybe the Spanish end up turning themselves into, sorry, once again, into going and competing more with like the British and the French in what would be the 13 colonies in Canada.
Empire full of gold that could be conquered. It's really tempting. But without native allies, all of that would fail. And for the short term, Cuba just wouldn't have the manpower for another expedition. In this scenario, the Aztecs continue to survive on for a while.
Spanish,
now,
Holy Roman
wait a
Empire,
second,
all that.
you say again. You keep interrupting me. What about the Columbian Exchange? Smallpox. Millions of natives died from Old World diseases.
Talk about
yeah, a population of 6 million reduced to a tenth of that within a century is bad news no matter what. And this would happen regardless of Cortez's victory. The key difference, though, is this. The Battle of Otumba happened right before smallpox really kicked in. And should that remain the case, this means that
still would have spread the
Mesoamerican
disease,
civilizations would be decimated, but not conquered. The natives wouldn't be vulnerable to these diseases forever. It'd only take a couple of generations before the locals adapted to these new pathogens. Timing is key to this scenario.
Biologists, is that true? Adapting to it? I mean, after an insane death rate of like 90%, it would still happen. They're not going to evolve that quick to that. Remember, this evolution isn't going to happen that quick. You're talking about millennia of biological development happening on these two continents, completely separate from each other. They're different worlds. I don't think that adaptation would happen without the same death that happened in reality there.
And to the fate of Aztec society. The question
would just,
you're all
like,
probably
adapt
wondering
away.
is, how likely would it be for the Spanish or other European powers to come back with an even more serious military expedition? Here's the thing. It wouldn't be as sudden as you might expect. Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs was an unexpected success. It certainly wasn't Spain's main priority. It wasn't even the priority of Cuba. The Cuban colonial government knew they didn't have the manpower for an expedition that Cortez wanted.
In this scenario, I think it would be like what European relationship was with Mughal China and the Ming Dynasty and the Tokugawa and all those things. Some kind of varying levels of interaction of some kind, which still would have, given the diseases and stuff like that from those interactions. Doesn't take conquest to spread that stuff. So,
and he went anyway. If that gamble didn't turn out, then it would be a while for Cuba to get those men back. Mainly because of Spain itself. Whenever talking about this topic, there seems to be a grandness to it. An empire falling, a momentous occasion, and it was for sure. Just not if you were in Europe.
Yeah.
To Spain, the events in the Americas...
Yeah, it would. If he's saying there's no Columbian Exchange was massive for Europe, right? The benefits of the food that came across back to Europe, the potato. If there's no Columbian Exchange, there's no potato. Look what happens to the diet of Europe with that, and corn. Corn's in a quarter of all grocery products. The population of Europe, Africa, Asia, everywhere went up considerably because of that. This interaction was massively positive for Europeans, and if they didn't have that relationship that came with the Columbian Exchange, it would have been, I think, a big deal.
Side quests on the edge of the world. Had Cortez failed, the Spanish wouldn't have gotten furious and sent endless conquistadors to teach the Aztecs a lesson. Instead, they'd blame the Cuban colonial government for wasting resources and be more stingy with what the colony can do. There were far greater headaches to worry about without wasting men in the jungle. Sure, tales of a city of gold would be tempting, but not enough to rearrange your entire foreign policy around.
There'd probably be no... Well, I wonder if the Spanish would have held to the line of demarcation and all that and basically stayed out of Asia if they hadn't had this success. Because the line of demarcation established by the Pope between Spain and Portugal happened before this stuff, good 20, 25 years before. I wonder if they would have been more interested in growing their empire out of like the Philippines and stuff like that. Maybe they just become a trade empire like Portugal did.
Without that relatively quick victory, the Spanish sit back and wait. Meanwhile, not profiting
There's
from the
so many
spoils of such a conquest
alternate
like
outcomes.
they did in our time. And that would have consequences. Consequences to Charles V. 16th century
Habsburg.
Europe was messy, and Charles V
Habsburg
ruled
too.
over a lot of it. Charles ruled over Spain, the lowlands, parts of Italy, and was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was at the head of an empire already stretched thin.
One thing I need to probably learn more about
Holy Roman
is how much did the Holy Roman Empire and Charles really impact what happened in the Americas? Or was that far more of the Spanish internally, and like we said, the governors in the Americas? How much direct, interaction and influence did Charles and the Holy Roman Empire have? Because this is the 1520s. This is during the Protestant Reformation, where the Holy Roman Empire is dealing with Martin Luther and all this stuff as well.
Emperor. He was at the head of
their empire is getting fractured because of those wars and all that stuff.
Already stretched thin. Although he was now king of Spain, he wasn't even Spanish,
Technically,
or Castilian,
on paper
or
he was.
Aragonese. In fact, his taking the throne led to one of the most brutal uprisings in Castile. Charles was always busy fighting France in the Italian wars, contending with the Ottomans, and competing against the Portuguese. One of the key
I was wondering how
reasons his
powerful
vast
was he
domain
really in
could sustain
Spanish
conflicts was the Spanish treasure fleet, which poured tons of silver to the royal treasury. A fifth of all profits made in the New World were given to the monarch and spent on his wars. If the Aztecs were victorious, even if temporarily, that line of credit just never exists. Spain never sees that explosive
Spanish
growth
Empire
from getting a head start. They're less powerful, and perhaps might risk just imploding outright thanks to overextension. The New World funds would be crucial.
I just think the Holy Roman Empire wouldn't have dealt with Spain very much. Spain wouldn't. The Holy Roman Empire wouldn't be as affected as just Spain as a whole, I think.
Especially when it came to dealing with the French, and especially the Ottomans, now ruled by Suleiman the Magnificent. His
height of the Ottoman Empire.
Adversaries. It's possible
Well, that's in the
Spain
1600s.
losing its teeth, the French and Ottomans more openly unite in a common front. Could we see a solidly established French-Ottoman alliance? Perhaps. The Turks could move even deeper into Hungary, which might affect, of all things, the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther was busy in 1520. His excommunication a year later sent Europe into chaos. In our timeline, Charles V already made certain concessions to the Protestants. He needed the princes for the defense of Hungary, so there's two things that might happen. Charles might not need to consider the princes' support, if they're already at risk of losing Hungary anyway to the Turks, leading to Charles being hardline against the Protestants. However, Charles might do the opposite, since he has less funds to back up his words. This might lead to an empire that is more tolerant of Protestant princes and rebels, since it frankly can't fight them. Which decision Charles made?
The Holy Roman Empire is so intertwined with their power coming from the Catholic Church that, like, them putting aside their differences to fight against the Ottomans. I mean, it's true. Like Martin Luther hated the Ottoman Empire, and Muslims and Jews and all that stuff. But like, would they have put their differences aside to like fight the Ottomans that way? I don't think so. Plus, the Ottoman incursion is going to happen after the so much of the dust and violence of the, well, you can have the 30 Years' War and stuff, but so much of that was settled already with the Protestants.
They make, only he could decide. But either one alters how the Reformation transformed
we might have
Europe. If he was more tolerant,
timelines
instance,
that wouldn't
maybe
interact.
there would be
maybe
less
here.
religious minorities that wished to flee to the New World. That sort of stuff. What all of this means, though, is that under Charles and Spain's monarchs following him, they are far more distracted on holdings in Europe. In fact, taking over the Aztecs is like they won the lottery in our timeline. And in this
That's a good way to say
they
it.
didn't. Spain is still powerful.
That's a good way to say it.
Just not dominant. And they would remain distracted away from the New World for a while. Probably even like 100 years, considering how much power and resources would remain in Europe. Any attempts, like I said before, would not be as successful as the first. Speaking of centuries, these couple centuries or so that in our history were considered Spain's golden era now just don't exist. That allows their rivals to play bigger roles, frankly everywhere, both in Europe and in our case, Latin America, or what would have been Latin America, because now it'd still be Aztec, Maya, and native territory, with other smaller powers from Europe looking to tap into a forbidden market. To the Spanish,
I don't think the English would have had any more success than the Spanish would have.
Were frankly
if that was the case,
just devil worshippers. They sacrificed a lot of humans. They had scary-looking gods. Frankly, destroying these pagan idols and converting these people was the only interaction they were interested in. If the Aztecs survived,
well, and their labor,
maybe even rebound,
their labor, all that mining, because remember what the Spanish are trying to get out of the Americas is gold and silver. It's the only thing that in Asia that they like anybody wants to trade with, right? So gotta be able to use that local labor, which they did extensively. They did in the Aztec Empire, but especially in the Inca Empire, just adopting the Mita system right on top of them.
I can't imagine there would be trade or a relationship between them and the Spanish.
That's probably where I disagree on that. It was so beneficial. Because the Europeans, Spanish, they dealt with everybody, every empire out there in the world. Europeans got involved with. They want money. If they're not going to get it by conquest, they're going to do it by trade.
Formal interaction.
And there's plenty the Europeans could trade with, like we said, with technologies for that.
May be viewed as giving into Satanism, and their continued
they don't care because
is just another.
Remember, the Europeans already deal with like the Ottoman Empire, in anyways, like Arab traders. It's not like there was not trade and stuff going on there. Plus, again, they're trading with the Muslim and the Muslims and the Hindus in India, and with the Chinese and all these other different religious systems as well.
Of a crusade they cannot complete yet. So Spain really wants to take.
They just wouldn't be able to exploit it,
but they just can't yet. Meanwhile, there is this empire that they don't want to trade with, but it has more gold and riches than can ever be imagined. For the fun of it, I might imagine a black market begins of sorts, legally and morally. Dealing with the Aztecs is seen as collaborating with Satan, but there would still be some men who would make a deal with the devil.
Remember, they think like the Spanish themselves, as devout Catholics, they think that the Protestants are led by Satan. I think everybody's led by Satan.
Peers and pirates who would brave the dangerous journey west, dodging Spanish galleons in the Gulf to trade with the Aztecs, giving them gunpowder, horses, livestock, and iron from the old world,
sure,
all for gold from the new.
I think the Empire would have just done that anyways.
These men would become rich from dealing with the Aztecs. Many might be viewed as even cursed. But outside of pirate myths, the reality is that the Aztecs were rich, and there was a market that the Catholic Spanish weren't officially tapping into. Yet others were, maybe even other kingdoms, like England. England during this time was the underdog, and they famously employed privateers to mess with Spanish ships.
Because they couldn't compete with them there. So they just stole from them.
Not a stretch that the English, above all others, would begin to trade with the Aztecs,
till the defeated
both
Spanish
to become rich and also to mess with the Spanish, perhaps creating secret bases alongside a still uncolonized Gulf of Mexico, away from Spanish eyes.
Well, this is where, though, I think this is what the Spanish would have been doing if they hadn't taken over the empires. They would have established these ports and colonies around the Aztec Empire.
A still uncolonized Gulf of Mexico, away from Spanish eyes. With less funds and more focus on Europe, Spain can't patrol this region as effectively as they did in our time, so certain vessels make their way past Florida and into a secret cove. I'd like to imagine that these pirates might even sail to what we would call Texas. Houston, Texas, more specifically. You see, Houston has a bay sealed by two islands. It's the perfect distance from Aztec territory and Spanish eyes. My main point is
the English
that
going there, my bad.
Spain, this land that was monopolized by them is now in competition, not just European. Other native factions would have survived too. Many neighboring tribes willing to topple the regime, especially the neighboring Maya. Maybe by the early 1600s, England and France could attempt to conquer what was virtually unclaimed territory by supplying the Maya and other rebel groups with everything that they needed. Regardless of the final outcome of this,
it would have just been harder though, because by then the Aztecs would have had all those technologies to defend themselves with.
Region would inevitably collapse and become defragmented, creating a power vacuum which every colonial nation would try to exploit. I'm imagining a scramble for Mexico or something. Who knows? Maybe it spirals out of control.
Yeah,
Different colonial ventures, pirates and natives, all fighting over what was just New Spain in our time. It'd be an interesting place to be. I can't even start to imagine what the outcome of these conflicts in the Gulf would be. All I can say is that Spain would need to fight tooth and nail to get land that they kind of just absorbed in our history. Without that jumpstart, how quickly could others have exploited the vacuum? Could the Scottish have gotten that Panama colony they were hoping for all along? Probably not, but it'd be funny to think about. If the English or Dutch or French did have influence in the Gulf, it'd be through fleets of private ships and paid mercenaries.
Well, and it would have been the same thing that happened with all those places. They didn't conquer inland kingdoms. They establish ports and just dominate the seas.
Be wars in Europe shift the balance, and islands are given to the victors. There's a lot to imagine from this. Frankly, the Mesoamerican success throws a wrench in the colonial experiment and perhaps even postpones globalization. Not to mention, what would happen to his expedition?
Just wouldn't have been as
which only occurred a decade after Cortez. All I can say for now
Pizarro
is
have
that
happened?
Cortez was Spain's one best shot, and by fate, by God, or by plot armor, he erased an empire, raised its capital, and built Mexico City on its bones. Had he failed, the Gulf, Europe, and the colonization of the Americas might have went down a far more strange and complicated path. But maybe that's something to imagine for another day. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Awesome. Final thoughts? All right, so you can see through, a lot of the interjection I did there. Of all the Alternate History Hub videos I've watched, which is a lot of them, I think this one I probably had the most disagreements on. Actually, I think probably pretty clearly, probably had the most disagreements on about what I think the outcomes would have been with that. But that makes this all fun because it's like, I got my opinion. He's going to have his, I didn't pre-prepare, obviously like the specific arguments and the evidence or something like that. But like, I think there's a lot to be able to disagree upon. So anyway, what did you all think though? What do you think about the conclusions? Kind of Cody was coming here with that. You heard my conclusions, or at least my disagreements in there. It's one of the things that's fun about alternate history. So anyway, love to hear what you guys think about this. And with that, we'll see y'all next time.